Hello, I'm Desmond P. Ryan, the author of the Mike O'Shea Crime Fiction series and the Mary Margaret Cozy series, and you're listening to the Dark and Stormy Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to episode 185 of Dark and Stormy Book Club. It's time for September's What We're Reading. Enjoy.
I'm Ann Dart.
I'm Tracy Stormy.
And I'm Kathy Knight.
And together we are
It Was a Dark and Stormy Book Club,
a podcast for mystery lovers.
Welcome.
If you enjoy our show, please consider contributing to the Dark and Stormy Patreon. By becoming a patron, you will help us create better and quality content. There are also benefits to becoming a patron, such as exclusive content and Dark and Stormy merchandise. Become a supporter at patreon.com/darkandstormybc. Check our website for the link. We appreciate any and all contributions. Thank you.
It's time for What We're Reading for September. We're back from vacation and we are thrilled because the three amigos are back at least for one episode. We have three excellent books for you to think about for September.
Well, I am very glad to be back, at least for today. I missed everybody. I am still busy with my schoolwork, but I did take time out to read The Icepick Surgeon: Murder, Fraud, Sabotage, Piracy, and Other Dastardly Deeds Perpetrated in the Name of Science.
Ooh.
This is by Sam Kean. I listened to it on audio, and it was narrated by Ben Sullivan, put out by Hachette Audio on July 13th of 2021. So Sam Kean starts off this mad romp through the history of scientific discovery with the tale of the first recorded unethical science experiment designed by none other than Cleopatra. In his prologue, Sam details the very methodical means by which Cleopatra would procure a handmaiden who was sentenced to death. Apparently, this was a frequent occurrence. She would make sure that the handmaiden wasn't already pregnant by giving her a substance to induce abortion, have her forcibly impregnated by a manservant, then have her belly torn open at a predetermined amount of time in order to determine exactly when you can first tell if a fetus is male or female.
A fun time back then.
Yes. They came up with 41 days. Well, because Cleopatra took such a keen interest in medical science, and Plutarch reported that she experimented on prisoners with poisons, this particular legend was widely believed until it was discovered centuries later that it isn't until 9 weeks into a pregnancy that a fetus develops genitals. Of course, Cleopatra's biography was written by her enemies. Take that as you will. Scientists are usually the good guys, brilliant men and women who can see the mechanics of the cosmos and the world around us. They dream up solutions to explain how everything works. They hypothesize, perform many experiments to back up their hypotheses, present their findings, and are hailed as heroes for making the world a better place. Huzzah! Unfortunately, more often in reality, experiments flop, funding is hard to find or taken away, colleagues refuse to accept new ideas or results until finally enough evidence is presented to be convincing. Perhaps it's not so surprising that scientists, who are only human after all, turn to unethical means to further their journey of discovery. It is also a fallacy to expect someone who is smart to also be ethical, just on the basis of their intelligence. Albert Einstein said, "Most people say it is the intellect which makes a great scientist. They are wrong. It is character." Many motives may drive the scientist to behave unethically: obsession, greed, the need to be right at all costs. I'm going to summarize a couple of the stories that Sam includes in his book. There's William Dampier, who in the late 1600s and early 1700s was admired by Charles Darwin and Sir Isaac Newton as a brilliant naturalist, an expert on winds and currents, and whose work advanced nearly every scientific field that existed at the time. Dampier wrote the first meteorological account of a hurricane. Nearly 1,000 citations in the Oxford English Dictionary trace back to his writings, and he introduced dozens of words into English, like banana, avocado, chopsticks, and posse. His life is thought to have influenced the tales of Gulliver's Travels and Robinson Crusoe. And William Dampier was also an honest-to-God pirate. He tried to go straight once, but you know what they say. You can take the navigator off the pirate ship, but you can't take the pirate out of William Dampier. Let's just say it didn't take, and he found that piracy was the best means of furthering his science career. In the story of Henry Smeathman, Kean draws a straight line through scientific discovery in the late 1700s to the practice of slave trading. When Smeathman first arrived in Sierra Leone, he was appalled at the treatment of Africans by slave traders. Smeathman was a pauper, but he had a fervent dream of becoming a gentleman naturalist and becoming elected as a Fellow of the Royal Society, the most prestigious scientific academy of the time. His morals were not enough to keep him separate from the slave trade, however. At the time, field scientists had to rely on slave merchants for food, supplies, mail, transport for themselves and their specimens, and for the lonely Smeathman, social contact. He began to rationalize that, since he was a good person, those with whom he associated couldn't be all that bad, right?
Yes.
This slippery slope sheds light on how intertwined early scientific discovery became with slavery. Morally righteous, Smeathman was not the only scientist of the time to dirty their hands in the slave trade. Heavy scientific hitters like Carl Linnaeus, the father of taxonomy, who developed the system of naming species that we still use today. Linnaeus used collections of specimens that were brought back by slave traders and delivered to research institutes, private collections, and even still reside in some of the most famous museums in the world. Edmund Halley, of comet fame, solicited data from slavers about the moon and stars. Sir Isaac Newton himself used one crucial set of data that came from French slave ports in Martinique. And the prestigious Royal Society sent questionnaires to slave ports for observations and profited from investments in slave companies. As Kean notes, collections were crucial central repositories for use in research projects and were all built on the infrastructure and economics of slavery. Other chapters relate the story of anatomist grave robber John Hunter, who is the model for Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, because he received the Well-Heeled Society at the front door of his majestic house and the resurrectionists and sack-em-up lowbrow thugs at the back door. There's a tale of murder, one of sabotage, Thomas Edison's animal cruelty, and of course, the story of Walter Freeman, the man who developed the tool used to perform a transorbital lobotomy, and from where the title of this book is derived, an icepick. While Joseph Mengele, arguably the most well-known unethical scientist, is mentioned, he is not the focus of any chapter. Aside from Thomas Edison, the scientists profiled are obscure footnotes in history, but whose stories are glaring examples of the misdeeds perpetrated in the name of science. Each chapter in the Icepick Surgeon explores a different transgression, with a thorough examination of the scientist's biography and their descent into immorality in tales that are spun by an expert storyteller, each gripping the imagination of the reader like any well-told story told round the campfire, or as Newsweek called it, a brainy beach read.
Sounds interesting.
It's very interesting. This is really interesting, too. Kean finishes the book by speculating on what crimes might be committed as we move into the future of science. New technologies in advanced computing and genetic engineering might provide ample opportunity to do good, but also to do much harm. It would be so easy to reprogram AI for nefarious deeds. Space exploration will eventually lead to colonization of other celestial bodies, maybe the moon or Mars. Would it be ethical to use upscale scarce, expensive resources meant for the Mars colonists to put up a murderer in a space prison, what else do you do with them? Sam's ample imagination conjures up a whole host of possibilities for futuristic crimes, things that make you go, You can find out all about Sam on his website, www.samkean.com. And he's also got a podcast. So shout out to a fellow podcaster. It's called The Disappearing Spoon. And I devoured all of it and hope more episodes will be coming out soon.
So what's the podcast Disappearing Spoons about? The same topic?
Not necessarily about crimes committed in the name of science, but obscure footnotes in scientific history that everybody will know about the outcome, but they might not know how things came to be or anything about the scientist who made them come about. One of the stories was about Galileo's father. Apparently, Galileo's father was a very famous musician at the time. He inspired Galileo to think in terms of mathematics with music, but that was kind of the gist of it.
I've been looking for a new podcast. That sounds pretty interesting.
If you like obscure facts about science, and I do, so.
Very good. Thank you, Kathy. My book is called A Study in Crimson. It's by Robert J. Harris, and it was put out in October of 2020 by Polygon Press. I was attracted to this book because it brings back our old friend Sherlock Holmes. It's another one of the pastiche that are common nowadays. And this one is pretty good. It's loosely based on a movie with Basil Rathbone, and it was called, and I'm sure if you like Sherlock Holmes, you've seen this movie at least once, and it was called Sherlock Holmes and the Voice of Terror. It was put out in 1942 by Universal Studios. It pits Sherlock Holmes against the Nazis. I enjoyed this movie. It's sort of an adaptation of this movie and Jack the Ripper. It's London, and it's 1942, and of course London was undergoing the Blitz, where there were blackouts constantly and bombs going off. I don't know how those poor people lived through it. They did. But a killer is going around and calling himself Crimson Jack. He is stalking the streets of London, and he's murdering women on the exact dates that the original Jack the Ripper did his killings back in 1888. People are saying the Ripper has somehow returned. Is he a descendant of the original Jack the Ripper? Or is it some madman just going around copying his quote-unquote hero? Well, they bring back Sherlock Holmes. Of course, Inspector Lestrade is now very high up in Scotland Yard, and he thinks of Sherlock Holmes, and he brings him back to investigate this series of murders. It is a very well done adaptation. It's very true to the canon, with one exception, that he is now in 1942 and not back in Victorian London. Dennis Conan Doyle wrote to the producers of the movie and said that he felt that this movie was incomparably the best Sherlock Holmes film ever made. So the original 1942 movie was sanctioned by the descendants of Conan Doyle. The one thing it does do in this book is it explains how Dr. Watson and Sherlock Holmes served during World War I. They've always said that Watson was injured in Afghanistan, but it never went into how. It never really went into how Sherlock Holmes served. He served